I will share my screen. Okay. This is the fifth Unilab Body System webinar. I am Sara Botto for ones that who doesn't know me, and I work with Eleonora Gambucci and Margherita Cioffi in Unilab, and in particular in the framework of the body system activities that comprehend a series of activities to foster the sharing information among the cities that participate Unilab project, like webinars like this one, face-to-face meeting workshops, and website space as a repository of material. And considering the website, I will share with you a news. The body forum is it now online. You can go there as requested by the cities during the Castillon meeting, one of our last workshops. And you can go there in the project area as showed and in the body space, and you can see the body discussions icon as indicated, and there you can add new topics as I showed in this slide. You can add a topic title and an image, and then again the subject, again the topic title, the body discussion. The body discussions is automatically set, and you can add text in the body section. So now you can ask for suggestions, post ideas and solutions, and create new discussions. You can see my presentation, my screen.
For me, your slides are not passing. I'm just seeing the first slide.
Okay, now you can see it.
Yes, now I can see it.
Okay, yes. Perfect. So as I was saying, this is the screen, the page in Unilab body space page for the forum, and I try to. I don't know why I don't think you'll see my screen, my other pages. I don't know why. Okay, now you can see my screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. 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 Now, okay. Again, this is the body forum. Sorry for the inconvenience. The body forum link on the Unilab website and body space, and this is the icon with the body discussions newly added. And this, as I already mentioned, is the screen you can see when you can add. You would like to add topics. So. I will record this webinar with all this information, and I will share with all of you this presentation so you can check better later. But you can now ask for suggestions as you requested, post ideas and solutions, so create new discussions in this forum. The next body system activity will be the workshop during Tampere physical meeting that will take place in September 2020, in order to better response to this now global emergency. So the webinar agenda. I will briefly present the topic of today, so the financing MBS. Then there will be 3 interventions. Philippe Leconte, environmental economist at BRGM, that will speak about cost-benefit analysis, results from analysis of different MBS scenarios to reduce disaster risks in Rotterdam, Les and Prague in the framework of NIAD project. Then we'll have interactive sessions with all of you, so you can share your questions also in the chat box during the presentations, and of course you can speak loudly after the presentation. Then we'll have Oshani Pereira, Director of Sustainable Infrastructure at IISD, and Jor Palaske, nature-based infrastructure expert at IISD, that will share with us cost-benefit analysis, economic valuation of ecosystem services on 2 natural assets, the Maristanis wetlands in Sardinia and the Saloum Delta in Senegal. Again, we'll have an interactive sessions dedicated with all of you. After this one, Camilo Benitez Avila, researcher, public-private partnership at Deltares, will speak about business models, all life cycle financing approach they had, with focus on practical case studies like Washington, D.C., USA, and in particular dedicated to maintenance topic in the framework of an NIAD project. And then we'll have a final interactive session Q&A. So this Financing MBS webinar will deepen topics requested by the cities of UNALAB, in particular the cost-benefit analysis and good practices for it. So why choose MBS, nature-based solutions, instead of gray solutions, let's say, and then business models and fundings for the nature-based solutions and their maintenance. So we can start with the first presentation. I will leave the floor to Philippe.
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen now.
Yes.
Is it okay? Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to present now, so my name is Philippe Lecointe. I'm an economist at the French Geological Survey at the BRGM, based in Montpellier in the south of France. What I'm going to present is the results of the cost-benefit analysis of different MBS scenarios that have been made in the framework of the NIAD project in 3 different case studies. And this is the result of the collective work of the different authors that are here, so that I'm going to present individually. In a nutshell, what I'm going to do is present very briefly why this economic assessment is important. Then I will give some elements on the case studies. I will also present briefly the methodological framework that have been applied in the different case studies, present some of the results of the economic value, and provide some conclusions and recommendations that are resulting from this work. So as an introduction, the rationale for the NIAD project in general was based on the increase of climate risk, and especially the increase of water-related risk, and specifically in the case studies that I'm going to present, the increase of flooding risk, with the IPCC estimating damages will increase by 77% by 2050, I think. Sorry, and the doubling of centennial flood in the next 3 decades. In the last years, the main solution that has been developed to manage flood risk has been gray solutions, and which has shown some limitations. among them the environmental damages that may be created by the creation of the gray solutions themselves, and also the high maintenance cost that they represent. And more recently, there is a growing recognition of the role of ecosystems, natural or created ecosystems, in the risk mitigation and also to produce a diversity of co-benefits. But these benefits are also threatened due to climate change and urbanization, and this is the reason, one of the reasons for the emergence of the concepts of nature-based solutions. I want to just come back to the definition of nature-based solution by the European Commission, which are solutions to societal challenges that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective, simultaneously providing environmental, social, and economic benefits and help build resilience. So somehow I wanted to recall this definition that you probably know, because you see that the economic efficiency is somehow entrenched strongly in the definition of the European Commission. So this evaluation of this economic evaluation of NBS scenarios is important, because also cost-benefit analysis is a prerequisite for large public-scale investments. Now in Europe, is becoming a standard practice. And carrying out this economic assessment is necessary to convince decision makers and also to serve as a basis for building decision models. So what we did in the NIAD project is to develop a common methodological framework that has been fully applied for the economic assessment of a nature-based solution, that has been fully applied in 3 case studies. The Rotterdam case, the Les catchment case, and the Bragg catchment case in France. So we have different scales in our case studies. So in the case of the Rotterdam case, which has been led by a field factor, this is more of a neighborhood scale scenarios that we are looking at. So we have a gray strategy that we are looking at that is basically based on the installation of separated sewer systems across the entire neighborhood and the installation of higher retention permeable pavement. So this is the gray solutions. Then you have a hybrid solution, which is about the creation of natural retention, storage, and infiltration areas, mainly in public squares, and the creation of retention ponds, bioinfiltration system, and the use of aquifer storage and recovery system. And the replacement of the combined sewage system with a separate sewer network for the stormwater collection and the distribution to the storage and infiltration areas on the squares. So this is the hybrid strategy, and in the green strategy, you have a much wider development throughout the neighborhood of green infrastructure to increase pervious areas for local stormwater retention and infiltration in all types of public space. So it can be in gardens, in squares, along the streets, on sidewalks. So a much more decentralized management of stormwater. So that's the Rotterdam case. In the case of the Les, so Les is close to the city of Montpellier in the south of France. is a small Mediterranean river in which urban runoff risks, urban flooding is a strong issue related to Mediterranean episodes. And we have tested 2 different levels of development of nature-based solution. One, which is mainly about the development, the deproofing of the city with permeable pavement, solid deproofing in public squares, and the development of small biosways along roads. The level 2 is a more ambitious one with a large development of green roofs, larger vegetated biosways, and the conversion of parts of the parking space, 25%, with open vegetated retention basins. This is the case of Bragg, the Bragg catchment, which is more of a urban rural catchment, in which the idea here also is to study 3 different scenarios. One is based on gray strategy and the construction of large retention dam and upstream and reservoirs. A high ambition NBS, which is maybe about construction of small natural retention areas upstream of the Bragg River, and the widening of the riverbed downstream and the wetland restoration. And then the very high ambition, which is basically based on high ambition NBS, and that adds to that some costly gray infrastructure that I will not detail now. So I wanted just to give a snapshot of these different scenarios that we have been studying in the three case studies. The overall methodological framework that we have been using is basically about assessing the benefits and the cost of the different NBS scenarios that are considered as alternative policies, as compared to a business as usual scenario, which is, depending on the case, either a gray alternative or a no intervention scenario. And we have been looking at 4 different blocks: the cost of implementation of these different scenarios, the estimation of the opportunity cost, to which I will come back to, the evaluation of the damages, the avoided damages related to the reduction of flood risks, and the evaluation of all the other co-benefits, with the idea of the compilation of benefit-cost ratio for these different scenarios. If you represent schematically this methodological framework, you see you have 2 different scenarios. One is the business as usual, the other one is an NBS strategy. And we've been looking at these different blocks of cost and benefits. So the main benefit in our case is in red, which is the reduction of water risk damages. And you see that also in the last column, it becomes a benefit because you have reduced damages. In terms of benefits, you also have the increase of co-benefits, which is related to the creation of nature-based solution. And in terms of cost, you have 2 types of cost. One that is the implementation costs, and the other one is the opportunity cost, which is related to the reduction of market value. For example, because nature-based solution have a large land footprint, you may, for example, put agricultural land out of production, and this reduction of agricultural land production comes out as an opportunity cost in this analysis. And then the idea has been to compile a cost-benefit analysis that will compare these benefits and costs. So if I come back to the different blocks of this assessment, we have the implementation for the assessment of the implementation costs and the opportunity costs. We have mainly been using the life cycle cost methodology that has been developed by the TARES within this project, which normally focuses on identifying activities and cost determining factors to maintain a certain level of service, in our case, avoiding water-related risks. In practice, what we have been looking, Rotterdam has been using this approach exactly, while in the Les and Bragg, we have been looking at scenarios that have different levels of service, and we have been evaluating the different costs for these different scenarios that do not necessarily have the same impact in terms of reduction of risks. And we have been estimating costs either directly in the Rotterdam case, because they had a pilot project in which they could collect actual data on cost, and we have been doing value transfer for the other 2 cases. And the opportunity costs have been evaluated related to the land use change that is brought by our NBS scenarios, using the cost of land, the value of land, sorry, as a proxy of these opportunity costs for Rotterdam and Les. And for the case of Bragg, in which NBS are mainly done on private land, we have been looking at the reduction of revenues due to the use of this land. I'm going a bit slow. So in terms of avoided damage, this has been a strong effort of the NIAD project to work on this particular aspect. The different steps have been the following: first, characterizing the hazard events with models, doing an assessment of the exposure of the assets, and looking at the different assets that are maybe impacted by these hazard. Then make a link between hazard and assets using damage functions, and then being able to calculate for different events the value of the damage cost. Once this CAT model is evaluated, the idea is to estimate the impact of the nature-based solution on the hazard, and then to be able to assess the avoided damages related to our NBS scenarios. In terms of co-benefits, we have been using 3 different approaches. The direct valuation approach, which has been used in Rotterdam and Les, which is basically using models to be able to evaluate the impact of NBS in terms of physical indicators, say carbon sequestration, and then using proxies to make a market price estimation of this variation of the physical value, for example, a carbon price to evaluate the benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, and then do this for different ecosystem surveys. One of the main approaches that has been used is use stated preferences approach, which is based on carrying out surveys to estimate people's willingness to pay for the co-benefits that are associated with our NBS scenarios. In this case, we provide an overall estimations of the value that is generated by NBS and not detailed by co-benefits. And it gives the opportunity to collect also some socio-cultural indicators of co-benefits. In the BRAG, we have been doing a survey with 405 respondents, and in the last 412 respondents. I'm going to skip the benefit transfer approach that has been used also in BRAG, but I'm not going to present the results now. Very rapidly now going to the results. So here you see the result of the cost-benefit analysis for our 3 case studies. What are the main elements that are coming out of these cost benefits? So first, you see in gray the cost of the NBS the cost of the different scenarios. What you see, especially in Rotterdam and in BRAG, in which gray solutions have been evaluated, is that the implementation cost of gray solutions is higher than our cases with NBS. And in the case of Rotterdam and BRAG, they have the same level of benefit in terms of avoided damage. So we confirm in these 2 cases the advantage of NBS in terms of reduced costs for the same type of results in terms of reduction of damages. Other point that we see is that if now we look at opportunity cost in blue, the opportunity cost may be quite large actually, and may change a bit this cost efficiency analysis. You see that they may be actually quite strong in, especially in Rotterdam and Les. Now, if you look at the benefits, so you have in red the benefits in terms of avoided damages. What we see is that despite the fact that we have been designing this nature-based solution mainly for their impact in terms of the reduction of risks, what we see is that the reduction of risk remains a relatively limited share of the benefits that are generated with our scenarios, and that the largest share of the benefits comes from the other co-benefits that have been evaluated. And now if we look at the cost-benefit ratio, we see that we have different situations. In the last, we have in our 2 NBS scenarios, we definitely have a positive cost-benefit ratio, but in Rotterdam and in BRAG, if you include the opportunity cost, the cost-benefit ratio is not necessarily positive for the NBS scenarios. But we have to see that for our gray options, the situation is actually even worse. So I'm going to skip this because I have said it. Just one other simple point that comes out also from our cost analysis is that here it's in the last, we have just compared a cost effectiveness ratio, which is the cost per cubic meters of retention. And we see that depending on the individual solution, not the NBS scenarios, we see that there is a large heterogeneity in terms of cost effectiveness, with bioswales and retention basins that are in this area of 150 to 300 euro per cubic meters of water retention, whereas for green roofs, for example, it's can be up to 10 times higher the price in terms of effectiveness of water retention. And not to take so much time on the presentation. In terms of discussion, I just wanted to say on the method that the design of NBS and scenario is a key step in the evaluation process, and it has to be based on stakeholder participation. And it needs also to lead to a physical quantification of these scenarios so that you may be able to evaluate them physically and also economically. In our case, the evaluation, of course, mainly relied on value transfer, except in the Rotterdam case. The evaluation of opportunity cost require more research, especially for the development of NBS on public-owned infrastructure, because the proxy we have been using may be questionable. And the assessment of avoided damages require large modeling efforts for the evaluation of the impact of NBS and on hazard and damages. And the last discussion point is the fact that we report only on a monetary evaluation of co-benefit, which only represent a partial value of the co-benefit, as many recent studies have emphasized. And the final recommendation is that, so NBS aiming at reducing water risk cannot be assumed to be economically efficient. There is a need for this economic valuation of benefits and costs to be able to identify the best strategy in a context of limited public funding. The largest share of the value of the NBS comes from the co-benefit, and I think this is one of the main conclusions that come out of our work. And this has large implications in terms of NBS funding and the need to maximize the co-benefits in the design of these NBS. And one last point is that the thinking that I have now in urban areas is we should go from designing NBS to solve one main problem, for example, flooding in our case, to a strategy that is to manage scarce urban land with nature-based solution and maximize the diversity of benefits that these nature-based solution may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you, Philip. So now, if someone can have questions, we can start a discussion with Philip.
Yeah. Hi, Euro speaking from GAB Foundation from Switzerland.
Hi.
I have one question. Thank you, Philip, for the presentation. Maybe I didn't catch the name of the assessment tool. Was it the tool from Deltares or was it developed by NIAT project?
We developed a framework basically that has been presented in a deliverable of the NIAT project. Has the different building blocks, and we have guidelines for the different building blocks. One is about the evaluation of cost that has been developed by Deltares. We have one on the evaluation of avoided damage that has been developed mainly by the CCR and the University of Valencia. We also have guidelines for the evaluation of co-benefits that we have coordinated in BRGM. So you have different blocks, and they give guidelines on how to carry out this assessment, but it's not you don't have all the keys just looking at the guideline. It requires quite a lot of data collection at the local level to be able to carry out the analysis.
Okay. So even to do a modeling on avoided costs and maybe also specific NBS interventions where those interventions need to happen, you also need kind of a consultation, right, with local stakeholders, and then
exactly.
No one that will tell you that, but you need to merge more tools together and do consultation. Yeah.
What we have is basically a methodological framework that gives all the different steps that you should use, that present the different methods. But then you have to actually have also human resources on the ground, experts to be able to carry out. It's not a button that you push and that would help you at that stage, at least, that will help you assessing directly your NBS scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Great, interesting. Thank you.
Singok speaking from Deltares. I was wondering how the stakeholders from the cities received your results, because I was personally involved in a sort of consultation on this kind of cost-benefit analysis in the Netherlands, and municipalities were quite ambiguous as to how useful this was for them. So I'm quite curious how the cities that you did received the results and used it in their decision making.
Okay. I can't really speak for. I've been coordinating the work in the Les catchment and not in the other two studies, so I don't have the answer for the other two. In our case, I think what struck the participants is how much value people grant to the co-benefits, and they didn't expect the co-benefits to be valued at such a high level, and especially. I mean, it was explicitly requested in terms of tax increase, the willingness to pay in our case, and people were not expecting people to have such a high level of co-benefit. So it came as a surprise, and it also provided some figures on things that people didn't have notion about. So we didn't have the same type of reaction that you had apparently. Now, how is going to be actually used for implementation is another. In the case of Les, we were really at a research stage, looking at hypothetical scenarios. So how it's going to be concretely implemented is a new step now.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh,
Seafox speaking again. If there's no other questions, I have another. I was curious how in the hazard model that you developed, how you analyze the impact of nature-based solutions in reducing the hazard.
Okay. I mean, it's been implemented in different ways. I will speak for our case. We have been working close hand in hand with the CCR, which is a reassurance company in France that is basically dealing with the payment of impacted people from a natural catastrophe in France. So they have a database on all the different damages that people have been suffering from after major events. So they have been strongly involved in building a model that has been doing the link between the hazard, so the urban runoff, and the damages. So they have been creating a relationship between basically runoff hazard and damages that have been observed in different events. And then what we have been doing, we were wanting to do an actual real impact of our NBS on the hazard and then see how it impacted the avoided damages. In our case, we were not able at the end to actually model precisely the impact of our NBS scenarios on hazard, or not, at least not with the model. So we used a simplistic approach, which was basically making a direct link between the amount of water that is stored in the NBS, because we have quantified the amount of water that we could store, and then make a direct link between the storage and the reduction of runoff that gave us an impact on the reduction of damages.
Thank you, Philippe. That's clear. Yeah.
okay. I think we could leave the floor to the next presentation. So, to George.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you very much.
Just one thing. Many documents are available on the website of the NIAID project, and it's work package 4, which is about economic evaluation. So you can find the deliverables on the NIAID website. Thanks.
Okay, we'll post the link on the UNALAB website too. Thank you. So, okay, George, now you are the presenter.
Okay, thank you. Just sharing my screen. Can you see the first slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect. Then I would like to hand the word over to Oshani Pereira at first.
Thank you, Georg. Good morning, everybody. It's absolutely a an honor and a delight to be with you today. We'd like to share with you 2 ongoing assessments that we are doing, led by Georg, using the sustainable asset valuation. We have introduced this methodology to you before. Next slide, Georg, please. I don't want to dwell on it because we have talked about it before, but in a nutshell, it is a simulation methodology. It's based on systems thinking, systems dynamics, and project finance. And it is customized to each project because we are endeavoring to generate investment grade advice. The next slide. To stress, especially following the presentation that Philippe made just now, is here again, we are looking at a methodology that we designed and we developed with asset owners and with stakeholders. So we begin with conversations with asset owners and stakeholders to draw the systems map. You have a graphic on the slide of a systems map. We collect project specific data from the stakeholders. We design the scenarios based on risks and impacts that are important to the stakeholders. And then we share results and we run simulations on the fly, and we finalize our recommendations, again, based on a lot of input from stakeholders. Georg will be demonstrating a lot of this as he takes over the presentation now. Let me also tell you that on the Sustainable Asset Valuation websites, we have uploaded preliminary models. People can download them and begin to play around with them and try to customize them to your own needs. So we're moving increasingly to a very much a publicly accessible simulation service that we offer to stakeholders, cities, landowners, and others as we go along. Georg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oshani. Just being back from Senegal from a visit last week, I'm excited to share first the results of a provincial assessment where we look at the role of natural infrastructure in the context of a province, and afterwards a regional application in Italy with the Marisanis project. So the Savisanum application focuses on the department of Foundiougne in Senegal, which is located in the southwestern, central western coastal part of the country. And the aim of this assessment is to assess the value of ecosystem services provided by natural infrastructure in the context of this province, and in the face of also increasing degradation, both human cost and cost by climate change. In addition to the estimation of that value provided by natural infrastructure, we also look at what would be the cost of replacing these services with built infrastructure. As we've seen in the previous presentation, the costs for gray solution are often higher, especially when we come to the costs that are often not considered in the assessments. And so what we want to provide with this is to show that the multiple services that are provided by natural infrastructure weigh heavier into the analysis if considered, as I will explain on the next slide. In order to conduct such an integrated assessment, we look at 4 aspects. The first one is, what are the services provided? So there we are mainly looking at the valuation of ecosystem services. The second aspect that we consider is, what is the cost of providing these services? So rehabilitation cost, maintenance cost. This is difficult to assess on provincial level and easier to assess if we can collaborate directly with the asset owners, because they would know what are the annual costs of maintaining the asset. Then we look at the third point, which is, what are the economic activities enabled by the services, which is kind of the spillover that we get from ecosystem services to local communities. In the case of Italy, for example, there are services such as nutrient absorption and others, which are essential for maintaining the economic activity without having to invest in additional mitigation measures, for example, for nitrogen loadings. And the fourth aspect that we will be looking at is what are the costs of built infrastructure to provide the same level of services, or to essentially maintain category 3. But I will talk more about this towards the presentation of preliminary results. For now, I briefly want to walk you through a causal loop diagram that we have developed for the Salum Delta. A causal loop diagram is developed to capture the local key drivers and feedback loops so that we can see how does the issue that we want to address, maybe stormwater loadings or maybe pollution runoff from roads, how do these emerge in the local context? Because if we understand the dynamics driving the issue, then we are also better able to identify mitigation methods that effectively address the problem. SAVI simulates both on biophysical level, so we look at water, we look at like surface areas, we look at many different aspects that are related to the pressures that we are analyzing. And we also look at socioeconomic and environmental impact. So we also assess employment, labor income from potential upgrades of infrastructure, as well as how do environmental pressures change with implementation of mitigation measures. And for the Salum Delta, since we started from the perspective of provincial development, we started with the total income that is generated on provincial level. And our hypothesis is that the total income leads to more private investment. And so we invest in machinery and other productive assets in agriculture, industry, and services, which ultimately increases our productivity and enables us to generate more income, hence generating more money that could be reinvested. At the same time, we also see tax revenues from income generation, and tax revenues enables the government to invest both in either sectoral productivity or in infrastructure assets, which are going to have productivity impacts across the board. So the 3 R's that we see in this picture are reinforcing feedback loops. So reinforcing loops drive growth in that if income goes up, we can see both tax revenues and private investment go up, as indicated by the small plus on the arrow. And if we walk around the loops, then we can see that there are only pluses. And that means that if those loops would work in isolation, we would see unconstrained economic growth. The same is also true for the agriculture sector. With investments in mechanization, we can also see production there going up, creating additional income and reinforcing our capability to invest. Now, in the context of the Salum Delta, we also know that once we see that there is an employment hotspot, we see labor-driven migration and flood-driven migration, which both increases the population. But with the increase in population, we can then see pressures on forest land because people there use forests for fuel, wood, and construction materials. And we can see an expansion in agriculture lands, mainly at the cost of wetland and mangrove area, but sometimes also at the cost of forest land. At the same time, the fertilizer use that emerges from agriculture production boosts agriculture yields and thereby also increases agriculture productivity. Now, with the pressures on land that we have just pointed out, we can see that increasing conversion of land causes soil erosion, which reduces agriculture yields. And the continuous degradation of forest land also reduces the income that can be generated from forests. The same is true for wetland quality. So with the degradation of the environment around the wetland, we can see the wetland going down, reducing the natural habitat for fish and hence fish production. And 3 other balancing loops essentially counteracting growth and representing the natural limits that we are working with in the, like, if we have to align economic development with natural integrity. So the balancing loops represent pressures that may emerge or that are emerging if we are not taking care of our natural infrastructure. We will share these slides after the presentation. So in case I'm going too fast here, you can revisit them and go through the loops step by step. This is the causal loop diagram before the visit, and this is the causal loop diagram after the visit. This version is in French. So the blue variables are essentially what was proposed by the stakeholders that needs to be added in order to adequately represent the local dynamics. But now let's talk about preliminary results. So how do the four categories relate to infrastructure and the value added? So the first category here, we can see the cumulative value of ecosystem services in billion francs CFA after 10 and after 40 years for example, nitrogen removal, coastal protection, and others. So this is the cumulative monetary value of ecosystem services that is provided by natural infrastructure. The second category, which would be the current maintenance cost, we do not have information, or we could not obtain information to date, and this information was requested during the workshop last week and will be hopefully sent to us within the next 2 weeks. The third category is the labor income that is maintained or enabled by having the wetland with its ecosystem services, where we can see that agriculture is a very dominant part. And here we still need to do some attribution in terms of what of these economic activities inside the province are actually maintained by the wetland. And the fourth category is the replacement cost of ecosystem services, where we have estimated costs for nitrogen removal and carbon sequestration, and are also planning to look into flood protection, but we are still awaiting data on both flood damages and envisaged interventions that will be implemented or that are about to be implemented to mitigate some of the pressures from increasing storm floods that they're experiencing in the Delta. What we do then is we compare these three categories, and we can see the income enabled and the value of ecosystem services on the left, and then the wetland maintenance cost and replacement cost on the right. And what we can that the income enabled outweighs all the other categories, and that replacement costs, provided that we only want to look at carbon sequestration and nitrogen removal, are now already outweighing the value of ecosystem services. That means that only by replacing 2 or 3 of the services provided, we already would need to pay more in economic terms than value is actually provided by the wetland. The second case that we are looking at, and I will be very brief on this case and happy to answer questions later, is the Maristanis wetland that we have been assessing in Italy. And it's the same approach. We look at both biophysical indicators as well as socioeconomic and environmental impacts, and want to analyze what would be options for wetland management or wetland interventions to maintain or even improve the environmental integrity of these assets. In this case, we are also looking at water supply, scenic beauty, and maintenance cost as a cost of maintaining the level of services of the wetland. Economic activities are agriculture, tourism, aquaculture, and fisheries. And the cost of built infrastructure, we look at the supply of water, also nutrient treatment or nutrient removal, carbon sequestration, and flood protection. So in the case of Maristanis, we can see that the value of nitrogen removal is off the charts, literally, because this is a highly agricultural area, and they have a lot of cattle for milk production and also meat production. And so there are an incredible amount of nitrogen loadings that are released into this wetland and also taken up by it, which is why this value is so high in proportion to all the other values generated. And the cost of maintenance, we are currently working with the METSI Foundation on finding these costs out so that we can give a holistic perspective here. And we're working with Vanya there, who has been a real help in finding data, and hopefully will help us to find these maintenance costs before we close this assessment. And again, we look at labor income from the different economic activities. In this case, agriculture is also dominant. The replacement cost, we look at nitrogen and phosphorus removal, carbon mitigation, and for flood damages, it's the same as for the Salum Delta, that we are still waiting for data to operationalize these, like the damages, and then also the mitigation measures required. Quick glance on the comparison of costs here. We can see that income enabled and value of ecosystem services is far higher than the replacement cost. And also compared to the maintenance costs, likely the benefits generated by natural infrastructure will outweigh the cost. This is an index that we have developed for the operationalizing ecosystem services in the model, but I'm happy to answer questions about this as I'm about to run out of time. So I would just hand over this to Oshani. Where we will talk then about the financing of natural infrastructure solutions. Thank you. Oshani.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you. One of the participants of this call asked a little while ago, what was the reaction of cities to analysis like this? The experience we've had is very much cities are saying, this is great. We believe that nature-based infrastructure can actually reduce the need for future infrastructure and avoid spending in the future. Next slide, please, Georg. What we find that we are required to do is to provide more predictability, more comparability, and more certainty across nature-based infrastructure opportunities to enable cities to commit their capital. Next slide, please, Georg. And going further to look at ways where they can crowd in private sector capital into investment in nature-based infrastructure. This is now the mantra today. You know, wherever you go, you find policymakers, countries and cities and regions looking to build assets that can also be financed by the private sector, and nature-based infrastructure is just becoming a part of this landscape. So we are in the process of rethinking how can project finance, which is generally the way infrastructure is financed, physical infrastructure is financed, how can that be reinvented for nature-based infrastructure? Next slide, please, Georg. Because as you've seen in both presentations this morning, what nature-based infrastructure does is avoid spending in the future. It avoids us needing to generate capital and borrow money and increase debt in the future. So what we need to do is to treat the cost savings provided by nature-based infrastructure as present day cash flows or as cash flows today. Next slide, please, Georg. And some ideas around this, and this might be utopian, but I promise you that they hold some promise. The first one is, I know a few days ago, there was a conference on energy efficiency organized by the European Covenant of Mayors. Unfortunately, here in Europe, we are only looking at 25% of the energy efficiency potential that has been absorbed by the market. But the principle on energy efficiency contracting and the principle of pay for performance might be very useful to be used in nature-based infrastructure, because like you do for an ESCO or for performance contracting in energy efficiency, you transform the energy saved in the future to today and you raise money on the promise of energy efficiency in the future, you raise the money today. The second we see is the emergence of green municipal bonds. These are general obligation bonds. The city of Geneva, where I'm sitting right now, raised a general obligation bond, a green bond, which was actually the proceeds of which are being directed at increasing green spaces in the city and maintaining the agricultural areas around the city for flood protection, very similar to what Philip showed us a bit earlier. We have also the emergence of sustainability-linked bonds, where the bond is actually raised based on the sustainability projects to which the revenues are being directed. So cities might be able to use these kind of instruments in the near future. Going down. Georg, please. Next slide. In the case of energy performance contracting, I really encourage all of us to watch this space a bit more closely, because we are coming to the stage where we can actually show the opportunity cost, and we can compare the capital and operating costs of nature-based infrastructure with built assets. And Georg has already showed you that there is no conversation to be had. It's much cheaper to preserve nature-based infrastructure as opposed to build physical assets that will provide the same service. Next slide, please. The next slide. I'm ahead of myself. Another space to watch is that we see public sector accounting boards making improvements to allow nature-based assets to be listed as tangible capital assets. I don't want to get into the technicalities of accounting here, but when a city or a municipality or a government can consider a park or a waterway or a landscape similar to they would consider a public building or a power plant or a water treatment plant on their accounting books, then they are not so inclined to say, oh, the opportunity cost of building on it is higher, because they are able to record all the nature-based infrastructure services and the core benefits derived from the ecosystem as costs and revenues on their balance sheets. It becomes a much more powerful way of promoting nature-based infrastructure. And the last slide, please, Georg. That's us. Sorry to have overrun the 10 minutes by 3.5 minutes. The microphone is yours, Sarah and Eleonora.
Thank you very much.
No worries, Oshani.
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Oshani and Georg, for your interesting contribution. And if you have questions, now you can speak.
Philippe Lecointe, can I ask a question?
Of course.
I just wanted to, I'm not sure I understood the way you evaluated the co-benefits in the cases that you presented. So you estimated replacement cost for the co-benefit, for the ecosystem services that are related to your nature-based solution. And you have another method as well. The replacement cost, I think I understood, but it's the other method that I didn't really get.
So the ecosystem services, most of them would need to be assessed on biophysical level first. So for example, what is the amount of water that is filtered in the wetland? How much nitrogen would be taken up by, in this case, for example, the wetland? And that is modeled in SAVI by collecting local data on, for example, water quality of the water flowing into the wetland, water quality in the wetland, and the water quality of the outflow. and together with a couple of other data such as residence time and without going into too much technical detail, just the general biology and physics of the exchange of nutrients and the update of nutrients, we can estimate, for example, how much of these nutrients remain in the wetland. And then there are multiple studies that put an economic damage cost, if you want to put it like that, on releasing nitrogen in the environment, which varies vastly from whether you would release it into a freshwater body or whether you would release it into the open sea. And by first trying to, or by first modeling and simulating these services on asset level, we can then take the net amount of nitrogen which is taken up as a point of departure for both the estimation of the damage costs and the estimation of the replacement costs in terms of what would be the size of the asset that is required to provide the same level of service, and what are the capital and operation and maintenance costs. I don't know whether I have addressed the question.
Yeah, it's very clear. Thank you.
Okay.
So any
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes. My name is Juan Barros. I'm from IAG Delft. My question is to Ms. Oshani. Usually, project finance takes into account the revenues that will come from an expected project. For those revenues would work as the warranties, as the guarantees for the loan or the finance of the project itself. So in the case of nature-based solution, the revenue has a negative sign. It's saving money by we avoiding floods or avoiding contamination or avoiding pollution or avoid degradation. So how would this element, which is essential for project finance, would be present? Would that be only with the green bonds that you mentioned that Geneva issued?
It can be a range of ways. This conversation offline, because I would eat up the whole webinar trying to go through several ways where how asset owners have been raising capital. You're absolutely right. There are no revenues from nature-based infrastructure, hence the need to compare it to built assets, which we are doing right now using Savvy. And in comparing it to built assets, we get a hold, and it might not be accurate as we would like it to be, but we get a hold of how much it would cost to build and maintain assets that would provide the same service. So we begin to move in a valuation mindset that we are already familiar with. From there, what we like to do, and we haven't done this yet, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to do it for both cases Georg presented just now, is to say, this is the actual cost saving. Based on the cost saving, on the promise of that cost saving, can we raise capital today? So in the case of a green bond, the coupon of the bond would need, in my opinion, would need to be directly linked to the avoided costs presented by nature-based infrastructure in the future, discounted to today's value. Today in Europe, we're living in a time of negative interest rates. So you hypothetically might be looking at a very interesting, a very, very interesting opportunity for a city to raise capital. And the yields might be very low. The issue is indeed with climate change, how predictable is the performance of nature-based infrastructure in a bond tenure of 10, 15 years. So, and for municipalities have to have the confidence to say, yes, that large area of garden will provide me with X many tons of water storage. And I can raise a bond to finance that or to maintain that, right? I need to have that certainty that that amount of storage will indeed be the storage that will materialize in practice.
Okay, thank you very much.
This is Camilo Benitez from Del Tares, and even though I will present something related to that, I want to add to this topic on the revenues that in our experience in NAIA project, we found that, for example, the European Investment Bank usually asks a very clear source of revenues from your investments, and in the terms of natural-based solutions means, for example, that you, let's say, prove that the natural-based solution reduce the operational cost of the authority has to provide flood protection, or on the other hand, that the municipalities are willing to increase the tariffs for water services. Let's say, for example, if you think in the water funds in Latin America, where the conservation areas well, say provides fresh water, you can in a way monetize that in terms of a tariff that utility will charge to the users. And finally, which is very important for Europe, is there is this policy to avoid to change agricultural practices based on subsidies to more market-oriented, let's say, mechanisms. So if your natural-based solution also has a co-benefits, for example, a higher productivity, that's a compelling, let's say, a case for attracting this investment. But I think, and that's something that I will present later, it's very important to point out that before thinking about financing, you have to really understand to which extent your project is leading to revenues, because this is this belief that the financing will just, or let's say, address or solve the lack of revenues, and that's obviously not sustainable from financial terms.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, Camilo, I think you can present, and if you have other questions, you can write on the chat box.
Okay, so then how can I screen share? Yeah. Okay, sure. So let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this invitation. My name is Camilo Benitez. I'm a PhD in public-private partnerships, and I'm part of the Tares, specifically the Department of Water and Delta Management. So we had the opportunity to work with some other institutions, including Philip, who presented first this morning in NAIA project. The objective of my presentation is of this webinar is dual. First, I want you to introduce the principles of the financial framework for water security, which is a methodology that we use in Del Tares for supporting decision makers to upscale what is security plans, and we mean with water security, how you address the concerns of too little, too much, or too polluted water, and a specific kind of setting of nature-based solutions in the NAIA project. And second, we want to give you a flavor of innovative organizational arrangements that around the world has been used for scaling nature-based solutions. The specific case that we will present is the stormwater rotation market, which is very famous, and it was implemented in Washington, D.C. So both the methodology of the financial framework for water security and a list of innovative organizational arrangements, such as the one in Washington, D.C., are included in a handbook which was one of the deliverables that we present to the European Commission in the NIAT project. So first, I would like you to understand, say, why is the financial framework relevant for our work here in Deltares. Most of our work here is supporting national and local authorities in the definition of master plans, or water master plans. But we often face let's say, a gap when we're trying to translate these plans, which is a number of measures, into a project pipelines, meaning an implementable project. So obviously this gap implies that there is a lot of knowledge loss of the needs assessments that you have conducted in the master plan, because it cannot be actually translated into feasible projects that will be implemented. We call that the implementation gap. So the role of the financial framework for water security is bridging this gap by means of supporting project preparation. And what means a project preparation way is providing evidence of the 5 business cases, and you have to understand these 5 business cases as a 5 conditions that you need to address in order to turn a master plan into a specific project. So, for example, your proposal needs to have a compelling case for change in a more strategic way, and this is most of the cases true if your investment is framed in a master plan development. But then you have to prove that the selected option optimizes public value. This is basically what already Philip presented. And then the commercial, financial, and management case is, say, the hardcore of the financial framework of water security. In these regards, in the latter stage, in these 3 business cases, you have to show that you can attract the market for, let's say, executing these measures. Second, that is you have a affordable proposal. A third, that you have a clear understanding how you will organize the delivery of service. And that's what I will explain in the next slide. So understanding that the core of the financial framework is developing the commercial, financial, and business cases for translating plans into projects, it's important to understand that the core concept of the financial framework is an implementation arrangement. An implementation arrangement provides the rules or the terms of the agreement for governing actors towards 2 specific aspects: cash profile and risk profile. What you see here is the heading of a table that I will show a case in the next slide. But first, I want you to understand how these elements, that this is a table that we produce as an outcome of facilitating this process of designing implementation arrangement with local authorities and other key stakeholders, how it's related to the 2 concepts that I want you to have very clear in this presentation, which is cash profile and risk profile. So cash profile basically means that is the relationship between the inflow of cash that you project and your outflow, and obviously you expect that's positive. But what we have found in Deltares, and that is very important, that you really need to focus to which extent the revenue is linked to a target group which is willing to pay for a service, a water service. And water service can be flood protection or freshwater supply or quality and so on. And then technically you have to prove how your measures lead to a function that delivers that service. Why? Because the target group will be willing to pay for that service, and that's the revenue that structure your cash flow profile. But then that's not the complete story. The second part of the story is the risk profile, because you can promise a value in terms of revenue because you are providing a water service, but you also need to show that you have the organizational capability to deliver that service and to maintain the functionality through the project life cycle. So then you have to identify who is the owner of the project or the commissioner, which let's say needs to have a clear understanding of the life cycle, the costs related to them, and how they will, let's say, address not only the responsibilities, but the risks that emerge from the life cycle. So that's the so-called strategy, which in, let's say, shorter terms, you can either assume the risk and the responsibility in-house, transfer to the market, or engage public-private partnerships. Having said so, now you will see that if you have, let's say, a solid organization that gives proof that you will deliver a service for target groups that are willing to pay, that's what I'm looking, let's say, investors. So then you can think about financing, and then to consider if there is a public-private financing, and for example, all kind of instruments that are available in the so-called blended financing scheme that it was already suggested before. So, for example, here also embedded the idea of exploring contracts such as performance-based contract, because the thing that you want is that you just pay for the service that you are delivering. But let's say that's also a topic that might require an extensive explanation. Here is the example, taking already the one that Philip introduced before in Rotterdam. So one specific part was the urban water buffer, which is a system which three measures, implementing collection system, sewer system, and reuse, that leads to two main services, rainwater capacity and fresh water. We identified the target groups that they were willing, by means of taxes of tariffs, to pay if they achieve a specific target. Then we work with the demo leaders, field factors, to understand how the project leader, in this case the Rotterdam municipality, understood the way for organizing this project. So around the life cycle, the strategy that they were, let's say, considering in terms of retaining the risk in-house, because they understood that they had the capabilities for doing so, it was cheaper than, for example, tasking the market. Or on the contrary, when, for example, competitive market was a more suitable alternative because in-house they didn't have the capabilities for doing so, and also some kind of innovation partnerships, because this project involved a lot of research and development, and then you have to share the risk. Say the financial framework and the handbook that we have delivered for NIAD further develops these cases, and let's say there is obviously a quantitative exercise that requires to be there in order to characterize the cash profile and the risk profile. But let's say this is the main concept, which is important to you to have in mind for considering the implementation of nature-based solutions in particular, and measures oriented to water security in general. Now, I want to address the second part of my presentation, which is pointing out that, well, project delivery and project finance is just one of multiple alternatives that at the moment promoters of nature-based solutions are considering for implementing this kind of, let's say, solutions to water problems. So I explained public project procurement, where the organization is based off a commissioner who has the authority to contract or to define if they did in-house the service. But you also have, for example, water stewardship, where the commissioner or the project owner is a private organization with concerns of, for example, corporate social responsibility or integration efficiencies. It looks a little bit similar for project procurement, but then you have a additional two, which are a little bit more complex. This is water collective investment, that they want water funds in Latin America, where different organizations pool resources for producing or procuring water services. So you not only have to be concerned about how you structure the project, but also how you structure, let's say, the responsibilities and risks in the consortium and in the trust fund. And maybe the most interesting one that I will briefly describe here is the water environmental markets, which is where the supply and demand for water services are defined by direct negotiation based on a market price. Maybe the most famous one is the one in Washington, D.C., which is called stormwater retention market. So let's say in general, the environmental markets operate upon the mechanism of offsetting impacts, losses of ecosystem. In this case, in the DC, great project developers, like for example, the ones that develop real estate or roads and so on, must reduce their stormwater runoff in situ. But they can also, let's say, acquire this service by buying retention credits in a market. You can see in this case then that you have an organization with demands, an organization with supply, that actually the one that is, let's say, implementing green infrastructure, and finally, a public organization which is regulating the market. So how it works? Well, here is an explanation that also you will find in the handbook to be released very soon. Is now under revision of the European Commission. But here, very briefly, what I want you to look at is the numbers. So first is say the core of the market, which is a transaction between the buyer and a seller, according to which the buyer, which is a real estate development project, has to, let's say, comply with their obligations for reducing stormwater runoff, buying these credits from the sellers, which is another organization implementing green infrastructure, or by implementing green infrastructure in their place. There is a third possibility, is they can buy the credits directly from the government. So for, let's say, in regards to the information mechanisms that regulates the price in the market. For example, if the buyer finds that the government will sell retention credits cheaper than the sellers in the market, well, obviously they will not go to the market for buying these retention credits. And also, there is a stormwater database that registers all the transactions and provides information about the price in the market. So therefore, let's say that enables the information of how the price of this retention market goes up and down. And finally, the regulator also supports the supply of green infrastructure. First of all, by a program of accreditation. So for you being a seller, the government has to authorize you and to check that you comply with the conditions for selling. Also, for example, they can buy in advance some credits from green infrastructure developers, and eventually, if the price of the market is attractive for the seller, they can resell. But it's a kind of guarantee that your investment in green infrastructure will repay. And finally, this is a startup grant program that is for encouraging new entrepreneurs to, let's say, engage in green infrastructure projects in their land. So for closing, let me tell you that this is a market that started in 2016. And in 2018, the number of transactions exceed and the ones already conducted in the previous years, and seems to be very promising mechanism in order to deal with the stormwater in the EC. So thank you very much, and I hope that you have now a clear insight of the two topics that I wanted you to learn today. First of all, the principles of the financial framework water security, which is a tool developed here in the STARS for supporting the implementation of projects in general related to water security, and in particular nature-based solutions. And second, the explanation of the logical, more complex and innovative implementation arrangements beyond project procurement. So I'm happy to answer your questions and also to engage in discussion.
Thank you very much, Camilo, for your presentation. So if you have questions, please.
No questions. Maybe I can ask something. I would like to refer to all the speakers, and I would like to ask if you have some suggestions for our municipalities in order to to improve their financing in NBS?
Well, first, I think that just following up the experience of the Washington, maybe the most important thing and sometimes overlooked is that people run to think about financing when they are not already have a let's say certainty about the implementability of the project, regardless where the money will come from. And for cities, and I think that Philip already mentioned that the key aspect is to understand what are the property rights that might allow or might constrain the implementation of nature-based solutions, because we already know that there are land extensive projects. So in our experience, say, first addressing these concerns, because that's something that at the end is what triggers skepticism in investors, is the first responsibility of a city, is to having a very clear, let's say, idea how they will deal with the property rights when you can implement. For example, in Washington, D.C., they operate upon the idea that the property line is private, but you can provide incentives to them in order to develop green infrastructure in their own land. But that might obviously be very different in Europe.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else have questions?
Yeah, I can ask a question. Juraj from GIB Foundation. Maybe this is a question to Georg and Oshani. It's just I'm not sure if this is integrated into the Savi tool, but maybe it is. It's how it works with biodiversity related aspects. For example, if there is a wetland which is 5 hectares of size, it might have a different value depending on the species, right? So if there is any threatened species, the value might be suddenly really high compared to a wetland which is in a place where there are no threatened species, maybe on the list of the IUCN red list of species. So how does this work? Yeah.
That is an excellent question, and something that we are also currently working on in Albania, for example, where there is it's an energy project, hydropower, and we are doing an assessment of what would be the impact of species in the watershed area, at least that part of the watershed area that is about to be flooded. So the valuation of species in monetary terms is difficult, because you need to have some kind of proxy that you would apply in order to value this, maybe the attraction for tourism and the potential that emerges from having that keystone species in the wetland. It is included in Savi, and we are currently grappling with refining this approach, also using spatial data, just to make sure that we do not overlook if there is indeed a keystone species in this wetland. But for now, we are using a multiplier approach, which we hope to refine based on species in the future.
Thank you. I think it's hard because the species, it's hard to evaluate the value of economic value of certain species, right? Because it's more about intrinsic value. That's why maybe it's not easy to crack it.
No, absolutely. That is along the toughest nuts to crack, and we have made some progress there, but hope to refine this even more in the future. But essentially, if there is information on biodiversity and other particularities of this wetland, then we will include this in the analysis and value it to the extent possible, because that is part of the customization process that we walk through with Savi every time. Because being a methodology, we have some blueprint models, if you want, that are then used and extended and customized to the local context that we work with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay.
Another comment now
that
we have asked for comments is that the assessment of benefits typically spans over the responsibilities of different departments. Like if we would, for example, look at having more trees and generally more green spaces in the city, would have an impact on air quality, which would reduce, for example, health impacts from air pollution, and hence the public health bill would be going down, giving the health department some additional budget that they can spend otherwise, but the direct department which would be investing into the infrastructure asset does not necessarily see the benefits of its infrastructure flowing back. So one recommendation that would come out of essentially every assessment that we do is that people from different departments sit together and have a conversation about what would be the impact of natural infrastructure, and would it make sense to join forces given that the benefits, at least in fiscal terms, will be returning on different layers of the administration.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, I can close the webinar. Thank you very much, all of you, all the speakers and the presenters. I will post the record of this webinar on the UNALAB website, as I already mentioned. And I speak especially to the municipalities of UNALAB. If you have other requests, specific questions on the topics treated today, please let me know and or post them on the forum just to start to use it, and I will share with the speakers, with our experts. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Goodbye.
yes, of course.
Goodbye.
I could share the presentation with all of you, of all of the participants.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good afternoon.